Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, February the 2nd, and after a massive document dump of files connected to Jeffrey Epstein, Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, last night resigned his Labour Party membership, saying he didn't want to embarrass the party further while claiming that he was a victim. You heard that right. He's the victim of a fake news smear. He's going to investigate claims attributed to him. But he remains, in theory, still able to take up his seat for life in the House of Lords. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy of Politico. 6 months ago, Peter Mandelson was among the half-dozen most important figures shaping transatlantic policy for the UK. In September, he was sacked as our ambassador to Washington. Now it looks like we have reached the end of his road in public life. And by the sounds of it, Mandelson himself made the decision to resign his membership of the Labour Party and had no discussion with Number 10 before he sent his letter, Playbook is told today. He is telling people over the weekend he has no plans to return to the House of Lords, where he's currently on leave of absence, but he can't be stripped of his peerage without primary legislation, and that is unlikely.
So another ending to Peter Mandelson's career. We've had a few of those. I have to say, Anne, I found it fascinating to watch after the September sacking just how quickly Peter Mandelson appeared to creep back into some parts of the establishment, the media establishment in particular, who seemed prepared to rehabilitate him after his resignation. So I suppose there's a question now, will he yet be back on our screens? Will yet be people be having him round for dinner? Maybe wait a couple of months out of politeness, then get out the cutlery or book a table at a discreet members club. At the top of the British establishment, I sometimes wonder, is there ever really a line that gets crossed from which you don't come back? I do wonder.
Well, I think there's a difference between having people around for dinner and being fascinated by someone like Peter Mandelson, who's had this extraordinary career and is also good company on the whole, and being back in public life. That would be the line that I would say is being drawn here this morning as we speak. And in a statement to the Press Association just after 10 last night, Mandelson, who I think wanted to take control of this, which was very much his default setting, he wrote to the General Secretary of the Labour Party, Holly Ridley, saying he'd been further linked this weekend to the understandable furore surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. He felt regretful and sorry about this. Very different tone, I noticed, to his rather more bullish attempt to come back with TV interviews a couple of weeks ago. But there are still some very carefully worded denials here we should look at. Allegations, Peter Mandelson says, I believe to be false that he, Epstein, made financial payments to me 20 years ago, of which I have no record or recollection, need investigating by me. Well, that is certainly the case, so let's see where that goes. But the optics of this and the release of that picture of a very relaxed-looking Mandelson standing in underpants and T-shirt next to a young woman in a bathrobe at an Epstein property, terrible optics. So you could see why Mandelson himself says he doesn't want to cause further embarrassment, as he puts it, to the Labour Party, and is stepping aside. He then repeats his apology to the women and girls affected by Epstein's crimes and says he dedicated his life to the values and success of Labour and is acting in its best interests, which might be getting a bit of an eye roll from other people slogging it out on Planet Labour.
Listen, let's just very briefly bring you up to date with exactly what the revelations are that have triggered this. They're all in the Epstein files, which were dumped late on Friday night, but going through them took a little bit of time, which is why it only came to a head last night. And these are files containing documents suggesting that Jeffrey Epstein sent Lord Mandelson about £55,000 in 2003 and 2004, and then sent Peter Mandelson's now husband, Ronaldo, £10,000 to fund an osteopathy course in 2009. Right, you just have to get your head around the timeline. On June the 30th, 2008, the year before Ronaldo allegedly got the osteopathy cash, Epstein pleaded guilty to charges of solicitation of prostitution and solicitation of prostitution with a minor. Now, he was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security facility at that point. And it is not long after that that we have the document suggesting that Ronaldo took cash for training.
That's really useful, Sam, that you remind us of that timeline and that sequence. And what this really points us to, I think, is what happens after that. I mean, that's also, it's not only distasteful, it's just very odd and all round in this story is the fact that for many people involved with Jeffrey Epstein, including Peter Mandelson and his then partner, Ronaldo, the fact of this conviction did not seem to matter. I mean, I think that is the moral point here. But then what happens is that 3 months after the last of these transactions, Peter Mandelson, by this stage, is business secretary in Gordon Brown's government and still in touch very regularly with Jeffrey Epstein. And in Epstein's guise as financier and connector, they're discussing how to water down Labour's new policy to reduce bankers' bonuses. And Peter Mandelson admits putting pressure onto Gordon Brown's late Chancellor, Alistair Darling. We see that in a note that he says to Epstein he's trying hard to amend the policy. And he even suggests that the boss of JP Morgan, JB Diamond, should call and mildly threaten Alistair Darling to get this loosened and watered down. Now, Mandelson says that these views on attacking bankers' bonuses were widely held by the industry at the time, but that's a different matter to advocating a mild threat to the government in which you are a cabinet minister against its own policy.
Yeah, and so legally, I think we are drawing distinction between different things that are going on this morning. There is the sort of allegations that Peter Mandelson contests about the payments, and the ones that seem beyond doubt because he refers to them as if they happened, which is his role in lobbying around bankers' bonuses. But the core allegation, adding to all the other allegations that we've got this morning, is that there is a claim that Peter Mandelson got cash from this financier lobbyist and then lobbied on his behalf when he was in Gordon Brown's cabinet. And that's the really toxic thing that has emerged this weekend, just to put it in a snapshot. What's your overall verdict on it?
I think Peter Mandelson's definitely gone into his Sunset Boulevard territory here now. A big figure, but absolutely now I think no way is there a rehabilitation. And the question is just, can he fight back? Can he save more of his reputation? And he was always an exception to many rules, wasn't he? Peter being Peter, as Tony Blair once put it, a huge figure in terms of being the architect of that 1997 success, and then moving from a kind of prickly Labour official, very smart, very focused in terms of knowing how to fight the political battle and turn the battlefield to Labour's advantage, from that role into a more erratic, less successful ministerial career. But my goodness, as you just reflected in that story, they didn't seem to feel that they could get by without having Peter Mandelson in some senior role, whether it was Tony Blair or Gordon Brown. He moved from that, and you'll have watched this emerge over the years, Sam, as have I, into a world of finance and connections at very high social altitude that seemed to matter to him in some ways more than the old politics. The interesting thing to me is, why did Keir Starmer, who was initially wary of Peter Mandelson as being from that high-octane Blair world, where I think he'd always had a certain underlying suspicion about that, Keir, and he used him quite sparingly as an advisor in opposition. But he was persuaded, I think, largely by Morgan McSweeney, who came from the Peter Mandelson machine and was very close to him, that he would be the best ambassador to the US. Even hastened Dame Karen Pierce, much lionized in Washington, D.C. She had to get out of the door. Peter Mandelson came in. And I think it's also because he wanted a Labour person in the job as well. The question, was he bamboozled by Peter Mandelson and thought the Epstein stuff would simply go away, took a few questions at face value, and it wasn't so bad? Or was Keir Starmer also being unworldly, and will he be damaged by that?
Look, I think that's absolutely the right question. And that's one of the reasons I'm going to want to move so quickly away from this today. But there are real lessons that could be learned over all of this, and actually still blame to be allocated. So in order to understand exactly the answer to your question. I spent last night and this morning going through my notes from September and October about all of this, because if you pull together everything that was said in the aftermath of the Mandelson resignation, you really do think, crikey, how did the appointment ever happen in the first place? Look, as you rightly say, Anne, this appointment appears to have been driven through by Morgan McSweeney. Keir Starmer at points got very irritated with Peter Mandelson at points in opposition. There are points where he kept Mandelson at arm's length. But for McSweeney, Mandelson was a constant. In government, we were told Mandelson and McSweeney would speak virtually every day. You know, the ambassador attended, while he was ambassador, Morgan McSweeney's wife's fundraiser in June 2025. That is not normal. And Mandelson said of McSweeney, I don't know who and how and when he was invented, but whoever it was, they will find their place in heaven. So I do wonder whether this closeness is the root of the problem. So did a personal closeness blind those at the top of number 10 to the problems with his appointment? And that's because it was so controversial in private at the time. We discovered after the whole furore, David Lammy, the then Foreign Secretary, was against the appointment. He was unhappy with it. And as I reported last September, the security services issued red flags about the appointment. I'm sure there'll be lots of talk today about vetting processes and things being done properly. However, sort of ignore the chaff that number 10 throw up. The security services raised red flags about the appointment. That's massive. But then there's one fact for me that trumps all other, which is that the worst details were already in the public domain. In the summer of 2023, almost 18 months before Mandelson's appointment, the FT reported that Mandelson was accepting hospitality, i.e. staying in Epstein's lavish Manhattan apartment in 2009 while Epstein was in jail, having pleaded guilty for soliciting minors. He stayed in the flat, accepting hospitality from someone in jail. And we know Keir Starmer knows about this because he was asked about it in the run-up to the election live on Sky News and said he'd have to look into it. So it just strikes me there's a case of see no evil, hear no evil, which is pretty terrifying for people in and around the top of the Labour project. By December 2024, when Mandelson was appointed, the egregious details were in the public domain. The security service had raised a red flag. The foreign secretary was against it. Keir himself knew he had doubts about Mandelson, yet Morgan McSweeney's will prevailed. You can see this in a world where I think there's going to be a soft left push against Morgan McSweeney immediately after the May elections to get him out as chief of staff as a price for keeping Keir Starmer in post. This is a big, big problem, I think, that will be discussed in Labour circles.
Wow. Yes, that's a really good point that it does throw this forward, doesn't it, into the role of Morgan McSweeney here and the internal dynamic in number 10. I'll just pause, Sam, to say on your good point about the security services, at least raising some difficult questions about the Mandelson appointment. I think that was actually more about his dealings with China and his the company he was involved in at that point, and its dealings with China. That, as far as my information goes, was more what they were looking at. The question is whether also raising a flag about Epstein or not. But either way, it was part of the picture. The person Peter Mandelson was, and the way that he was spanning worlds. And I think that was the difficulty when it came to the episode we would now entitle The Fall. In terms of the internal dynamic in number 10, it's interesting and influential even now, because if you remember, Sam, Tim Allen, Executive Director of Communications, also part of a group in which Mandelson was very key, going back to them working jointly in the Blair years, so understandably. But when the first story of the Epstein files broke last year, I heard that Allen, I heard this from another source, but one close to Peter Mandelson, knew immediately that Mandelson had to go. And he started to discuss the best framing and didn't want to hang around too long. He could see the potential damage to the Starmer brand from this. Now, the FT story then says that Morgan McSweeney fought back hard against this. What do you make of that?
I think that it was a bit more nuanced than that. There's a fascinating thing about the timeline, and I don't think Tim Allen comes out that well. Tim Allen was talking to Peter Mandelson on the Tuesday of the critical week, but of course Keir Starmer went into PMQs on the Wednesday and was mauled by Kemi Badenoch and emerged saying that he'd just taken 6 rounds of hits. So if Tim Allen knew immediately that Peter Mandelson had to go, he didn't exactly tell his boss. And I understand that was the source of some friction between them at the time. It isn't clear when Morgan McSweeney actually cut the cord with Peter Mandelson. There was a mysterious trip to Brussels from the guy meant to be running the operation at that critical point on the Wednesday, the day before Mandelson actually was forced to go. So it remains a little bit murky at exactly what point McSweeney changed his mind about the ambassador.
Doesn't it also depend at which point Keir Starmer was prepared to listen and who he wanted to listen to more? Just throw that in. But in terms of the knock-on about how this has changed the terms of trade, if we could just look forward about this, as we do on this podcast, look, Christian Turner has just got his final handshake in London from Warren Stevens, the US ambassador, as he sets off soon to go to Washington. The ambassador, also guest of honour at a big event around the Foreign Office tonight, by the way. So, this is all ramping up to the Christian Turner era post Mandelson as ambassador, co-custodian of the special relationship, the US ambassador says, so quite a warm launch for him. So there's a beneficiary of all of this. And it does remind us, Keir Starmer wanted a number 10 candidate to replace Peter Mandelson, but the furore over this meant that it went back in the direction of the Foreign Office, back towards a traditional, very experienced diplomat who's done some really hard yards and difficult postings. So, hey, it's an ill wind that doesn't blow someone some good, and that someone is Christian Turner.
Right, there are actually two political dimensions to this story. We've done the one about Mandelson, but of course, Keir Starmer got involved in another bit of it over the weekend when he was flying back from China, and that was to do with Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew. We saw those absolutely sickening pictures of him on the floor with a woman published as part of the Epstein files. Keir Starmer suggesting that Andrew should now face Congress. Effectively, that's the Prime Minister, who was the principal advisor to the monarch, saying that a member, a blood relative of the king, should go and face what would be incredibly difficult questions, not just for Andrew, but for the whole royal family. Begs the question, Anne, do you think that that's the position of the palace too? Do you think they wanted Keir Starmer to say that?
Not really. My view is he probably spoke as he found it, Keir Starmer, and was worried when he gave that reply on the plane back to the UK from his Asia trip that he was being left a bit behind the curve of public opinion, which, as you point out, as we see these awful images and the sort of general sleaziness that is now just attached to the name of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, that he wanted to say something clear about it. The reason I don't think it was particularly aligned is that the position this leaves the palace in is now quite awkward and needs to be addressed, I think, in the next days or so, because the holding pattern of just plonking Andrew at Sandringham, King Charles paying for him to be there rather than have him living on the benefits of the Crown estate, it's not really enough. So people will now start to ask, well, if the Prime Minister thinks that Andrew should testify, what does the king think? Is he going to ask or demand that his brother testify with this congressional committee? He doesn't, by the way, need to go to the US. That's been made very clear, including people I've spoken to on that committee. He just needs to get on a call and do it. So I think that will be the question. I don't think if it were aligned that we would have had it in that way. There would have been a clear messaging from the palace and the Prime Minister. This is moving so fast that it is basically one side is sort of saying something and then the other side is quickly, I think, deciding what they want to do about it. But I think for the palace, this is really a moment of truth. Do they go further in terms of cutting off Andrew and basically saying, they do have leverage after all. He is living on the king's shilling at the Sandringham estate.
25 years of behaviour to be raked over by congressional committees is something I cannot imagine that the heart of the royal family would want to see. There are also all of those years where Andrew was a trade envoy for the UK. So flight logs are something that could be dredged up to find out whether there's any overlap between the behaviour and the relationship with Epstein and the official role that Andrew inhabited for many years. We've actually just hit the 20-minute limit on this podcast. We probably need to draw it to a close. It's a messy and ugly and in some senses, depressing episode today. So we apologise for that, but we'll be back with more uplifting stuff if the government, opposition, other parties can generate it tomorrow. But I will see you then.
Back to it tomorrow.